Welcome to the InfoWars Nightly News. It is Tuesday, January 21st, 2014, and I'm Leanne McAdoo. Well, following an influential think tank's call for a humanitarian realpolitik stunt to be pulled in order to weaken President Assad's position, well, miraculously, a report has emerged just 24 hours before the Geneva II conference, which alleges to show systematic torture and abuse by the Assad regime.
If you have 11,000 bodies dealt with in a systematic way, then you can reasonably infer that this is a pattern of behavior which has to have higher authority.
That was Jeffrey Nice. He was on the legal team that inspected the authenticity of this report, which includes 55,000 digital images alleged to show evidence of 11,000 Syrian detainees tortured, starved, and executed. Now, the images were reportedly smuggled out of Syria by a defector named Caesar. He was a military police photographer who worked for the government for 13 years, and his job was to photograph bodies of detainees that were believed to have died under torture. Now, some are saying that the images are proof of abuse by the Assad regime, but the report raises questions, not only considering the timing of the release, but also the fact that the report was commissioned by Qatar, which has been an enthusiastic backer of the opposition rebels since day one. A spokesman for the Syrian Ministry of Information questioned the report's evidence, telling the BBC it was unclear where the information had come from or if the photographs were from Syria or from outside Syria, and he added that he was astonished at the figure of 11,000 victims, saying that it had not been raised before this report. Now, this report also arrives just days after the results of an MIT study were published. They concluded that the chemical weapons attack on Ghouta could not possibly have been launched from government-controlled areas. Now, you'll recall that that whole chemical weapons attack was about to serve as the pretext for going to war with Syria. We told you the day it happened that it was most likely the chemical weapons were launched by the Western-backed Syrian rebels who are aligned with al-Qaeda. And now here, MIT is backing that up with their study. They say it's basic math. You can just see the trajectory that this is where the weapons came from. And so here we have a clear political agenda with the release of this Qatar report. But the MIT study is being completely ignored by the mainstream media because it doesn't fit their agenda, which is, once again, the U.S. government trying to gear up and get us here in America in alignment with invading Syria under the pretext of a humanitarian crisis. But we didn't buy it last year. Over 80% of the American people were against invading Syria, and we're not going to buy it now. The West started the war. And now, while these think tanks are calling for this humanitarian invasion of Syria, they're also calling for an extraordinary crisis here in America. They said that they needed to regain control over those of us who have become awakened, and they need to regain control over our minds with some extraordinary crisis. But could FEMA be preparing for a pandemic? The Federal Emergency Management Agency is looking for contractors to supply 40-yard-sized dumpsters, along with experts who can dispose of contaminated biomedical waste during a national emergency. The request for information appears on the FedBizOps website and asks for feedback from waste removal industry vendors that can potentially provide either dumpster service and/or biomedical waste collection and removal services during emergency response events within the continental United States.
Ask yourselves, what are you doing in this time of great challenge? What are you doing to unlock minds?
Now, we know that this year's flu season is being hyped up as being really dangerous and deadly. And of course, that's only fueling this concern that the agency is preparing for a pandemic. But how are pharmaceutical companies leaving us vulnerable?
It's strange that back in the fall there was one story after another in every country that Big Pharma was finished with antibiotics. No more research on new drugs to replace those that bacteria have developed resistance. And they were going to focus solely on viruses and vaccines. It was strange enough that they would declare they were no longer even concerned about controlling bacterial infections. What you may not have noticed is the skyrocketing price and limited availability of doxycycline, a common antibiotic. Doxycycline is often prescribed in the early stages of exposure to Lyme disease, as a prophylactic for malaria, as a follow-up to dental work, and many other uses. And a prescription that used to cost $4 to $5 now costs between $160 and $200 if you can find a supply. There was an abrupt spike in cost about a year ago. The LA Times reported on it. Then a couple of months later, the CDC pointed out that there was a shortage. But after a year, the price is still holding firm at about a 50-fold increase. If there were a free market, a competitive free market in generic drugs, companies would enter the market, increase supply to take advantage of the higher price, and the price would go down. But not in the consolidated cartel of pharmaceuticals. And it's not a case of restricting generics in order to drive people to new, more expensive drugs. In this case, they're not interested in providing new antibiotics. So when a commonly used drug increases 40 to 50 times in a price spike and stays there, the question is the pharmaceutical cartel simply price gouging? Or is this a part of a push to get people to buy more medical insurance? Or is it something more sinister, like are they removing all antibiotics to intentionally leave the population helpless to a superbug? Or to a weaponized bacterial outbreak? Whatever's behind this, antibiotics have been overprescribed, they've been misused with livestock, and now we have strains that are created that are drug resistant, and the response of the pharmaceuticals is to gouge people on price and abandon research. You need to do your own research into safe and effective alternatives to pharmaceuticals, especially for infections.
Well, the U.S. Army is considering replacing thousands of troops with robots as it's dealing with sweeping troop cuts. A senior American officer has said that he's considering shrinking the size of the Army's brigade combat teams by a quarter and replacing the lost troops with robots and remote-controlled vehicles. Options under discussion include trains of robot vehicles that would follow human drivers in long supply convoys. The head of the Army's Training and Doctrine Command said the Army should follow the lead of the Navy in using technology to cut manpower, given the fact that people are the major cost. So while I'm all for reducing the lives of soldiers lost on the field, replacing them with these autonomous robotic killing machines does not sound like a good alternative. It's actually quite frightening. And considering the American drone program that's already killing tons of innocent civilians overseas, it's definitely not something that I want to see as the new battleground. But just as the government is cutting even more government jobs and replacing them with machines, unprecedented employment numbers are being reported. But it's a little contrary to all the happy talk that's coming out of D.C. According to a Wall Street advisor, the actual unemployment rate is 37.2%. And he says that the misery index is the worst in 40 years. Now, this advisor is David John Murata, who we recently reported he had advised anyone who was worried about an imploding economy to get a gun. And he said that the government just isn't being honest in how it calculates those out of the workforce or inflation. The unemployment rate, he says, only describes people who are currently working or looking for work, leaving out the number of people who aren't able to, do not want to, or cannot find a way to work. Unemployment in its truest definition, meaning the portion of people who do not have any job, is 37.2%. And of course, that is well above the Fed advertised unemployment rate of 6.7%. But why does the Fed want to underreport? Well, in addition to not wanting the Obama administration to look like huge failures, it's in order to maintain the psyop that everything's fine and they've got it all under control. Now you can watch The Alex Jones Show live as it happens at Infowars.com/show.
You'll find links to all of our content there and a free 15-day trial for Prison Planet TV.
More than 60 movies and documentaries all in one place at Infowars.com/show.